the point is, at the point where Descartes brings in his version of the ontological argument, he's just questioned the whole existence of the material world. And so he can't really base his arguments on that. So what he does is he reaches back for some a priori arguments, and he gets out a version of it. Now, we already began this, but they both rest on a conception of God's being, and we saw that St. Anselm works with God as the greatest being we can imagine or conceive. Descartes works with a concept of God as the supremely perfect being, or the being who possesses all perfections. The way that people like to talk about it, who discuss this, is God is the sum of all perfect qualities, or of all perfections. And so what Descartes is going to try to show is that the idea of existence is as much a part of the necessary concept of God, that God's an existing being, as having three sides and three angles is to the essential qualities of a triangle. Of course, Descartes, if any of you ever had to take analytic geometry or calculus in high school, Descartes actually invented analytic geometry. So he was a very, very accomplished mathematician, and in fact he uses geometry as a model for what he wants to do in philosophy. But at any rate, so he wants, again, to prove God's existence with the certainty of an axiom or of a proof in geometry. So, to understand his move, it's like this. We can't even conceive or think of a triangle without three sides or three angles. Say, well, I'm thinking of a triangle, but you know what? It doesn't have three angles. Well, then what are you thinking of? How can you think of a triangle and not think of it as having three angles? That's part of the essence of what we mean by a triangle. Well, I mean, what Descartes is going to try to show is that we can't even think of God in the traditional sense that God is defined in monotheism without thinking of God as an existing being. Would it help? Is it drafty in the halls? Shut? I mean, maybe without it.
Well, it's better because that door up there keeps opening to the corner coming from that way.
Yeah. Let me at least close this one. Yeah, I know. And I put on a thick shirt. This is really a coat I bought for the dead of winter, not for the beginning of fall. But anyway, so he's going to try to show that it's as essential to thinking of the concept of God that we think of God as an existing being. And so existence is as much an essential part of God's description as having three sides and three angles would be to the description of a triangle. So he's saying we can't basically separate existence from who God is. So why is existence not separable from his essence? Because, again, here's where we have this very Platonic assumption coming back at us. that the somehow perfection and existence go hand in hand, that if something is more perfect, it also exists to a greater degree. And so if you say that God is the being that possesses all perfect qualities, Descartes is going to go on to say, yeah, okay, but guess what? One of those perfect qualities, if we think that God is the sum of all perfections, existence is one of those perfections and has to be. So, and I did this last time, the way I like to conceive of it is, suppose we started out to try to describe God, and we had a list of traditional qualities. Omnipotence, God's all-powerful, omniscient, God's all-knowing. Omnipresence, God is everywhere. Omnibenevolence, God is morally perfect. Well, to some extent, Descartes would say, well, this is not a complete description of God as God should be conceived. A complete description of God as the supremely perfect being, as the being who has all perfections, would include existence in the list as a perfection, as a perfect quality. So here again, existence is supposed to be as essential to to our concept of God as having three sides or three angles is essential to the concept of a triangle. Well, so he says, so completely does God, the supremely perfect being, exist that God cannot even be thought of as not existing. So here we come to the same point that we saw in Anselm's version, that somehow the fool, the person who denies God's existence, would actually contradict himself or herself by denying God's existence. And you see how this would come. In other words, if the fool would say, well, I don't know whether I don't think God exists, but you know what, Descartes, I'll give you this, that if there were a God around, that God would be accurately described as the supremely perfect being. But it's just that the unbeliever don't believe Descartes that that supremely perfect being is around. And Descartes would respond, well, how do you think he would respond? Well, wait a second, you agreed with me that God has all perfections, but I just showed you that for God to have all perfections, existence has to be one of those. So you can't, on the one hand, acknowledge God as the being that has all perfections, and on the other hand, deny God's existence, because in assuming that God has all perfections, you assume that God is an existing being. Now, as you said, these arguments are part of an ongoing discussion, right? Now we saw that criticism of Guinillo about the fact that the reasoning used by Anselm in the ontological argument could, as far as Guinillo saw, just as easily prove the existence of the most perfect island, of an island greater than, of the greatest island, and so there must be something wrong. And of course he responds that somehow existence is a part of God's being in an essential way that it isn't part of the existence of the most perfect island. Now, I don't think he can consistently make that objection, but that's what he says. But summarize the argument, and then I want to go into the stock criticism historically that's been brought against Descartes' version, was brought against it by somebody who himself believed in God, and that was Immanuel Kant. But Immanuel Kant did not think we could prove the existence of God, but he did think that we were rationally justified in wanting God to be around as the guarantor of morality and of the fact that we reap what we sow. Kant thought we could rationally postulate it, because justice is not done in this world. We could rationally postulate a life after this life, and we could rationally postulate that God would be around to guarantee that justice is done. And of course, contemporary people, and soccer would have been a good example of this, say, well, you know what? Guess what? Justice isn't done, and life and the world is absurd. And they would reject Kant's claim that we have to assume God is around. But anyway, but Kant, in order to get out his own kind of proof of God's existence, which is not a total proof, he sort of shoots down every other argument for God's existence. But his most famous one is against this ontological argument. But to sum it up, you say God has all perfections. Existence is a perfection, therefore God exists, or God has to possess existence. And now, if I say this coffee mug is black, right? The mug is black. Well, this is a quality, an attribute of the coffee mug. And this is supposedly a thing or a substance. And we didn't go into that part of Aristotle's metaphysics. But when I say that something has a quality, or when we say that something has a quality, basically we predicate a quality in this case blackness of something, namely the mug. So in this example, black is what logicians call a logical predicate. It's similar to, but a little narrower in meaning than just, obviously one of the first things you were ever taught in English is that sentence structure is subject, predicate, object, right? No, subject, verb, object, but you have the predicate of a sentence. Well, it's similar to this, but here we're claiming that something has a quality. And the criticism that Immanuel Kant brings is directed against the way Descartes wants to take existence. And the way that we would say it nowadays is that Descartes, in his ontological argument, views existence as a logical predicate. You know, God exists, you know, or God has existence. Just as in this example, we're predicating blackness of the mug, in this example, we're predicating existence of God. So we say that existence in Descartes' version of this argument functions as a logical predicate. And Immanuel Kant's observation basically is that that's not how existence works. That basically for Kant, existence is not a logical predicate, but a logical predicate is, basically having an attribute like having the quality of blackness for a mug. But it is a necessary I'm going to try to say it in a more ordinary language and instead of logic speak, But it's a necessary fact, that in order for a thing to have any qualities, it must first exist. But to say it a different way, but existence is not one of those qualities. In other words, to get back to that list I had, basically what Kant is saying is, Descartes, you're wrong in putting existence into the description of God as if it were just another quality. I have a little Chevy Aveo out in the parking lot. And think about it this way. Say somebody wants you to describe your car. I say, well, it's a 2005 Chevy Aveo. It's blue, 4-door, sedan. It exists. It has, a 4-cylinder engine, and it's odd that in describing my car as one of its qualities, together with having 4 doors and being blue, I would say that it exists. In other words, Kant says that's not how existence works. Existence itself is not a quality of the thing, but in order for my car to have any of those qualities, having a four-cylinder engine, having four doors, being blue, it has to first exist. If it didn't exist, then it wouldn't have any of those qualities. But existence is not one of those qualities. But see, here's the thing. In order for Descartes to make his argument work, he's got to have existence working in the description of God, just like having three sides works in the description of a triangle. And that's what makes it self-contradictory to deny God's existence, because Descartes' building existence into the description of the God that has all perfect qualities when he makes existence one of those perfect qualities. And so what Kant is saying is, it is possible, unlike what Descartes and Anselm are trying to say. I mean, Kant is saying, okay, look, I personally believe in God. I come from a German Lutheran pietist tradition, and I think it's rational for people to accept God on faith. But Kant says, I don't think you can prove that God exists in a necessary way, in the way that that Descartes and Anselm want to do. And furthermore, Kant would say that if you take existence out of the list as one of the qualities that God has, then it's possible to deny God's existence without contradicting yourself. And how does this happen? Well, I mean, here's kind of like something that relates to what I was talking about, a car. A car has to exist in order for it to have any qualities, right? My car, which does not look like this, I remember the University of Virginia. They used to call the university, I guess they still do, the University of Virginia, the Princeton of the South. It was an Ivy League school in everything but the actual designation. And so if you looked in the parking lot, you could tell the students' cars from the professors' cars, because the students had the BMWs, the Porsches, and the Mercedes in the parking lot, and the professors had the beat-up old Toyotas and Chevrolets. Because a lot of the students came from money backgrounds, right? So at any rate, so for Kant, then existence is not just another quality in the description of something like the quality of being red is part of the description of a car. But again, it's a necessary precondition for things having any qualities that it exists. But existence itself is not a quality. So what Kant says is, we can describe a thing and all the qualities it has, like we could describe God. God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipresent. And then he says, or we could describe that car, then afterwards you talk about whether the thing that fits your description actually exists. In other words, I could describe my Aveo out in the parking lot, and then I could say, well, I hope it still exists out there. I hope somebody didn't rip it off or what. Which is not something I worry about here. Now, when I go from here and park it on North Avenue, it's a little bit concerned. Coppin charges us like hundreds of dollars So, I generally say, hey, I
That's
can walk
ridiculous.
a couple of blocks.
It should be free parking for stuff like that. Like, that's ridiculous.
No, it's not just because they don't have enough space. Plus, they need the money from us. So we describe a thing then. So here's how it relates to denying God's existence. So Kant says just when we deny the existence of something, Kant says we reject it with all of its qualities. So if I say there's no sports car pictured in this slide, I'm denying the existence of, a sports car. Then Kant says I'm rejecting it with all of its qualities. So basically, then you talk about existence or non-existence of the whole thing, but existence is not one of the qualities. So if we then take existence out of the list, then it's possible for the fool to admit, on the one hand, that God possesses all perfect qualities, but if existence is no longer in the list, then you can say, but I don't think the God who fits that description actually exists. Just like you can say, and so you're rejecting the existence of God with all of God's qualities, just as you're rejecting the existence of a sports car here with all of its qualities. And you don't contradict yourself. So again, Kant himself, a believer in God, is saying he doesn't think this argument works to show God's necessary existence. So again, to go back to Descartes' triangle analogy, remember he says we can prove that existence is as much a part of the concept of God as having three angles is to a triangle. So if we think of a triangle, yes, in order to conceive of a triangle, we have to think of it as having, three sides and three interior angles that add up to 180 degrees. That's just part of what a triangle is. But Immanuel Kant says we can consistently deny that there's a triangle there, and we reject it with all of its qualities. And so he doesn't think. So once you take existence out of the list of qualities in God's description, then it becomes possible to, reject God's existence without contradicting yourself. And so this shows that the ontological argument, as Descartes formulated, it does not absolutely show, God's existence. So we can describe God with all God's qualities, then afterwards talk about whether God, as a being that fits that description, exists or not, and no contradiction arises. So the argument doesn't show that we necessarily are committed to God's existence when we accept God as the most perfect being, if existence is no longer part of that description of God, but it functions differently. Now we want to look at some of Aquinas' a priori, a posteriori arguments. But any, can you see basically what's going on there then, as to why that's a criticism of this version? Now, remember we said it's an ongoing conversation. When I was in grad school, I think it was Alvin Flanagan, who's and Notre Dame who first got this argument out, but there is a more powerful version of traditional logic that also builds in and talks about concepts like possibility and necessity, like possible existence, necessary existence, and does it in a formal way. And these are not the sorts of things that ordinary traditional logic talks about. And necessity, possibility, impossibility are called modalities. Now, I'm not going to ask you that, okay? But this extension of logic is called modal logic. And I think it was Alvin Plantinga who got out this formal proof in this newer system of logic where concepts like necessary existence come into play. And he got out of proof a version of the ontological argument that does not depend on taking existence as a logical predicate. In other words, that treats existence just as Immanuel Kant thought it should be treated, but that seems to prove God's existence. And you know, the formal proof takes, I don't know, 8 or 10 steps. But, you know, without getting technical, the new version of it says something like this. If it's possible that there exists a necessary being, and possibility and necessity are, necessity is described as being true in all possible worlds, or for all assignments of values to the variables. What this new version goes from is, it says, if it's possible that there exists a necessary being, then we can conclude, and he gives a formal proof of this, that it is necessary that there exists at least one necessary being. In this case, of course, it would be God. In other words, think of it this way. Somebody denies God's existence as a necessarily existing, being. God had to be uncreated, eternally existing. But somebody might say, well, I really don't think that such a necessary being as God exists. But you know what? I'll at least give you the assumption, for the sake of argument, that it's at least possible. In other words, somebody could say, well, I know you deny God's existence, but would you at least agree with me that even if you don't think a necessary being exists, it's at least possible that a necessary being exists? And somebody, even if they're a non-believer, would say, well, all right, I'll agree with you, it's at least possible that there's a necessary being out there. Well, the problem is that they're just giving the game away and they don't even know it. Because this formal proof says you can can go from the assumption that it's possible that there's a necessary being to the conclusion that it's necessary that there's a necessary being. In other words, that there's no way there can't be a necessary being. And so again, you prove God's existence necessarily, but in a way that incorporates and recognizes Immanuel Kant's traditional criticisms. So this in the late 60s or early 70s, I forget when it first came out, this opened up the whole can of worms again. You know, after people had thought that Immanuel kind of basically dealt the death blow in the 19th century to the ontological argument, Plantinga's reformulation of it opened the whole discussion again, you know, as to whether or not the argument may work after all, you know. So it's been a continuing, ongoing, you know, discussion. Well, Aquinas' 5 ways. Actually, it's not just the first way. I was looking at Aristotle at the pages, and one of the things your book points out is Aristotle has a concept of a God as pure actuality, as the cause of all things. But it's more and he calls this God the prime mover. But Aristotle's concept of a prime mover, and it's in those pages on Aristotle's ethics, was a lot closer to the force of Star Wars. You know, an impersonal kind of in the background being that doesn't really necessarily have a personality. You know. Aristotle's prime mover, then, it is not really to be compared with the personal God of monotheism, who actually gets involved in people's lives and who is a person besides being the first cause. But in the Middle Ages, the works of Aristotle were being rediscovered. Some of the early Christians, while they liked Plato, were very suspicious of Aristotle, because he's not as ethereal and otherworldly. And you know, when they were burning books, you know, some of Aristotle's books, I think, got kicked onto the fire. And really, the works of Aristotle, for the most part, were lost to the Western world for almost 1,000 years. Until, oddly enough, though, they were preserved in the Arab world. And so during the Crusades in the Middle Ages, when people were going down there and interacting with those cultures, they rediscovered Aristotle's works. So here is Aquinas, and all this really impressive stuff is now being rediscovered. So he has to try to figure out, well, how do I integrate this impressive stuff from Aristotle with what I also believe is true coming from Scripture and church tradition? So as a theologian, he tries to synthesize Christian views with the views of Aristotle. And so we won't actually get into, I know I'm kind of behind, but it's kind of what else is new. But we'll get on track. But at any rate, the first 3 ways are versions of what's called the cosmological argument, and especially the first way that talks about motion really is just a retweaking in Christian language of a proof that Aristotle gave that the prime mover, that this for Aristotle, this impersonal prime mover has to be there as the necessary cause of what exists. So for Aquinas, it's not Aristotle's prime mover who's the necessary cause for what exists, but reinterpreting it in a Christian framework, it's the God of the Bible and church tradition. So you get essentially Aquinas retweaking this old version from Aristotle of the proof that the prime mover exists, but redescribing it in a Christian context and saying, well, the first cause of all things isn't Aristotle's impersonal prime mover, it's the personal God of the Bible and church tradition. At least that's Aquinas's conclusion. So he's very influenced then by Aristotelian thinking, we'll kind of look next time at his arguments, which that really well, actually, let's go. Since I led up to, we have just a couple of minutes, and I'll probably review this, but in other words, note how this argument isn't just from concepts in your mind. I'm just going to note this, and we won't go through it, but note, to get this argument off the ground, you first have to make some observations in the world. Namely, the things put each other into motion, and they cause each other. And so we'll look at potentiality versus actuality next time, because this again is a concept that Aristotle was very big on. And now Aquinas didn't have airplanes flying around the world, but he grabbed what graphics you think were. But basically, what he's going to try to say is, if things are in motion now, we can trace that back to a necessary cause of that there had to be some being to set it all in motion at the beginning, and so all three of these cosmological arguments are built around kind of tracing things back through a chain of causes to the very beginning, and basically trying to conclude that you needed a first initial cause of all things to get it all going. And of course, what would the first initial cause of everything be other than God himself? So that's how, these work. So look, you all have a great